Spring, 1945. Germany was collapsing. The thunder of Allied artillery echoed across the Rhineland as the once mighty Wehrmacht stumbled backward, retreating through burning towns and shattered forests. Smoke from destroyed convoys hung over the countryside, and the air carried the bitter scent of oil, blood, and ash. The war was nearly over, but for many on both sides, the hardest days were still ahead. Outside a small village near Kassel, a column of American soldiers from the 83rd Infantry Division advanced through a road littered with abandoned German vehicles. The fighting had slowed, but their nerves hadn't. Every barn, every field could still hide a sniper or a desperate soldier who refused to surrender. But that morning, what they found wasn't a platoon of armed Germans. Instead, stepping out from a ruined farmhouse came a group of women. A dozen of them, dressed in faded gray uniforms, their insignias hastily torn off. Some wore field nurse badges. Others looked like clerks or signal operators. Mud streaked their faces, and one of them carried a small white cloth, a makeshift flag of surrender. The Americans raised their rifles, instinctively cautious. The lead woman, barely in her 20s, raised her hands and spoke in broken English. "We are not soldiers," she said. "We are prisoners. Please." The lieutenant in command, 26-year-old Daniel Carter, signaled his men to hold fire. They advanced slowly, checking for weapons. There were none, only fear, exhaustion, and eyes that looked as if they hadn't seen sleep in days. The war had desensitized many of the Americans, but even they weren't prepared for the sight of German women surrendering in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't common. Most female personnel had already fled west with the Wehrmacht or been captured by the Soviets in the east. These few had been left behind after their convoy was bombed. The soldiers searched them quickly, confiscated what little they carried, mostly canteens, a few letters, and a tin of biscuits. Then, under Carter's orders, they were escorted to a nearby barn that had been turned into a temporary holding area for prisoners. The men called it the pen. The Americans weren't cruel, but they weren't gentle either. The rules of war said prisoners must be treated humanely, but hatred for the enemy ran deep. Many of these men had lost friends in the Battle of the Bulge. They had seen German atrocities in villages just days earlier. As evening fell, the camp settled into an uneasy quiet. The women sat together in the straw, whispering to one another in German, shivering in the cold. Some still wore Red Cross armbands, reminders that they had once tended to wounded soldiers. Now they were powerless. Hours later, as Carter walked past the barn, one of the women called out softly. She was tall, blonde, maybe 22, her voice trembling but steady. "Please," she said, "we have not washed for weeks." Carter stopped. At first, he didn't understand. The translator explained. They were asking for showers. He stared at them for a long moment, unsure how to respond. In a war filled with cruelty, the request sounded almost absurd. These were enemy nationals, part of the regime that had bombed London, that had built the camps now being uncovered across Europe. "Showers?" Carter muttered. "You've got to be kidding me." But the translator repeated the plea. The women weren't demanding anything else. No food, no comfort, just a chance to wash. They were filthy, covered in mud and lice, their hair matted from weeks of retreat. Carter walked back to his command tent, conflicted. Technically, he could ignore the request. They were prisoners. Supplies were short, but something about their desperation struck him. He'd seen what war could do to men, but to women it was worse. They weren't trained for this kind of suffering. He brought the issue up with his sergeant, a gruff veteran named Howard Reeves. Reeves laughed at first. "You want to set up a spa for the enemy, Lieutenant?" he said, lighting a cigarette. "We've got our own men who haven't seen a shower in a month." Carter said nothing. The sergeant shrugged. "Look, sir, you do what you think is right, but don't expect me to hand out towels." That night, Carter couldn't sleep. The sound of artillery echoed faintly in the distance, but his mind was somewhere else, in that barn where the women huddled together under thin blankets, whispering about home, about whether they'd ever see their families again. At dawn, Carter made his decision. He ordered his men to set up a makeshift shower line using a field water tank, canvas sheets, and a small generator that powered a pump. It wasn't much, just enough for a brief wash, but it was something. When the soldiers started assembling the setup, word spread quickly. Some of the men mocked the idea. Others looked on curiously, wondering if the lieutenant had gone soft. But Carter didn't care. "We're doing this right," he told them. "Keep it professional. No jokes, no stunts, just decency." By noon, the system was ready. Carter went to the barn and told the women they could wash, 2 at a time, under guard for safety. At first, they didn't believe him. Some hesitated, thinking it was a trick. Rumors from the Eastern Front had spread among the Germans, stories of brutal treatment by enemy soldiers. The fear in their eyes was real, but when the first 2 women stepped inside the tent, the others watched anxiously. The sound of running water echoed. Real water, not gas, not smoke, just clean water hitting the earth. Minutes later, the women emerged quietly, their faces transformed. One of them clutched a towel to her chest, tears streaking down her cheeks. Another smiled faintly, a small, fragile smile that seemed to break through the weight of the entire war. The soldiers looked away respectfully. Some offered rations afterward, small tokens, pieces of chocolate or cigarettes. For a few moments, the war outside the village didn't exist. There were no uniforms, no hatred, only human beings trying to remember what dignity felt like. As the last of the women finished, Carter stood near the tent, watching the scene in silence. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the wreckage of Germany. He thought of how strange it was, how something as simple as water could mean more than victory. Before continuing, I want to know something from you watching this story. From where are you tuning in? Comment your country's flag with pride and hearts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories from World War II. When night fell, the women returned to the barn, cleaner, calmer, and strangely grateful. Carter walked by later and saw one of them quietly folding a blanket for another. She looked up and met his eyes. No words, just a silent nod. He nodded back. He didn't know it then, but that small act of decency would stay with him long after the war ended, long after the world stopped fighting and tried to remember what humanity looked like again. The next morning, the world looked strangely quiet. The thunder of artillery had moved eastward, leaving behind only the crackle of distant fires and the heavy smell of damp earth. The war was almost done, but no one truly believed peace would come easy. Not after everything they had seen. Lieutenant Carter stepped out of his tent and saw the same group of German women sitting in the yard of the farmhouse, their hair still damp from the showers the day before. They looked different. Not soldiers, not prisoners, just young women again. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they looked human. The soldiers had started to treat them differently too. There were still boundaries, still suspicion, but something subtle had shifted overnight. Men who once stared with anger now offered them coffee. A private even gave one of the women a small pocket Bible, though she couldn't read English. One of Carter's men, Corporal Hayes, quietly approached him later that morning. "Sir," he said, "those girls said something last night, something about a camp nearby." Carter raised an eyebrow. "A camp?" Hayes nodded. "They said they were stationed near a labor camp for prisoners. The Germans abandoned it a few days before we got here. They don't know what happened to the people inside." Carter felt a chill. Over the past week, his unit had stumbled upon the edges of horror, the smell of decay drifting from barns, the silence of empty barracks, the rumors spreading like wildfire. He sent a small reconnaissance team out to check the claim. They returned hours later, pale and silent. What they found wasn't a functioning camp, just ruins, fences, and graves. The women had spoken the truth. Whatever orders they once followed, they had left that place behind, perhaps out of fear or shame. When Carter told the women that the camp had been found empty, some of them broke down in tears. Whether from guilt, fear, or relief, he couldn't tell. But in that moment, the line between captor and captive blurred in a way he hadn't felt before. For days, the small group remained in American custody. They helped with small tasks, cooking, cleaning, even assisting medics who came through the area. A few spoke enough English to communicate. They told Carter fragments of their lives. One had worked as a nurse in Hamburg, another as a radio operator in Bremen. None of them had chosen this war. They had simply been swept up by it. Carter's men, hardened by months of fighting, began to see them differently too. The jokes and hostility faded. These weren't faceless enemies anymore. They were survivors of the same hell. But not everyone approved. When word of Carter's shower camp reached a nearby headquarters, an officer came down to investigate. Major Thompson, a sharp, cold man from command, walked through the camp with a clipboard in hand, inspecting everything. He looked at the shower setup, the guarded tents, and the prisoners calmly sitting in the sunlight. He turned to Carter with a look of disbelief. "What exactly do you think you're running here, Lieutenant?" "Just following the Geneva rules, sir," Carter replied, standing firm. Thompson's tone sharpened. "You've got half the men talking about bathing German women in the middle of a war zone. Do you realize what kind of message that sends?" "With respect, sir," Carter said, his jaw tight, "I think it sends the right one." There was a long silence. The major glared at him, then finally turned away. "Just remember, Lieutenant," he said coldly, "you're not here to save them. You're here to win a war." When the officer left, the tension in the camp lingered like smoke. Some of the men worried there'd be consequences, but none came. Headquarters was too busy with the final German surrender to worry about one lieutenant showing compassion. A few days later, orders came through. All remaining prisoners were to be transferred to a larger camp under Allied control. The women were loaded onto a truck, silent and composed. Before leaving, the young nurse who had first spoken to Carter approached him once more. She handed him a small metal pin, a faded Red Cross emblem from her uniform. Her eyes glistened as she whispered softly, "Danke, for treating us like people." Carter nodded. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. "This war's over. Don't let it follow you." As the truck drove away, a strange silence fell over the camp. The men stood watching until it disappeared down the road. Some turned back to their duties, but Carter remained there for a long while, staring into the distance. He didn't know what would happen to those women, whether they'd ever see home again, whether they'd be judged as traitors or victims. The war had left too many scars for anyone to walk away clean. Years later, after returning home to Ohio, we remember their kindness. The letter wasn't signed with a full name, just an initial, H. But Carter didn't need more. He folded it carefully and placed it inside a box where he kept his medals. It wasn't about glory or victory. It was about something far more fragile. The idea that even in a war built on hatred, small moments of mercy still mattered. In interviews decades later, veterans often said that what haunted them most weren't the battles, but the faces. The people they met between the fighting, the quiet moments when humanity slipped through the cracks of chaos. For Lieutenant Daniel Carter, that moment came not in a firefight, but in a barn with a bucket of water and a handful of terrified women. His bio, Carter rarely spoke about the incident. Like many veterans, he carried his memories quietly. But sometimes, on cold spring mornings, when he saw sunlight glint off a water tank at the farm he worked on, he would remember that day. The trembling voices, the laughter after the showers, and the moment when enemies stopped being enemies. Decades passed. In 1970, Carter received a letter from Germany. It was handwritten in slightly broken English. "Dear Lieutenant Carter," it began. "You may not remember me, but I was one of the women your unit captured in 1945 near Kassel. I am alive, and I have a family now. I have never forgotten the day your men let us wash. It was the first time I felt human again after months of fear. Please tell your men, if they still live, that history often remembers wars for their blood and destruction. But sometimes, it's what happens in the moments of stillness, when compassion overcomes vengeance, that truly defines what kind of men we were." Because in the final days of World War II, on a nameless road in Germany, a handful of soldiers proved that even surrounded by ruin, humanity could still survive.